Okay, Gospel of John, chapter 20. I'm going to read the first 18 verses. John chapter 20, first 18 verses. Words will be on the screens if you don't have your Bibles with you. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. But Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary, Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. These are really pretty, aren't they? The lilies. Do you guys know what these represent? I mean, look at them. I mean, they're white, which kind of reminds me of light. They're in bloom, which reminds me of life and flourishing. It's wonderful for a day like today. But do you know what else they represent? Each one of these flowers was purchased and put here in memory of someone that is no longer with us. Someone that has entered into darkness. Someone that has succumbed to death. And so they also represent that. This past Tuesday, my Aunt Sandra passed away. And one of these lilies could very well represent her. But that is another light snuffed out. Another life that's come to an end. And it's a reminder. I mean, it was a reminder to me very much so this week when my aunt passed away after a brutal year of fighting against abdominal cancer. Each one of these lilies is a reminder to us that we live in a world of darkness. We live in a world where death is very much the reality. It's true, even on a day like Easter, we have to admit it. And you know what's interesting about John's account of the resurrection is that he begins the account with 3 timestamps. And two of them are very appropriate, and one of them is a little bit strange. He says, early in the morning, so it's good to know that. He says, on the first day of the week, it's good to know that. It's all pertinent information. Then he says, while it was yet dark. Now that one, I don't know if it's really necessary. I don't know if it's a necessary detail in the story. We know it's early in the morning. We know it's the first day of the week. Why do we need to know that it's dark? Well, I think John does this very purposefully. Because throughout his gospel, he's kind of held up for our eyes this juxtaposition between dark and light. He does so all the way back in the first chapter where he says, the light has come into the world, but the darkness has not understood it. And so we have Jesus, this light, coming into a world of darkness. A world of darkness that we very much still experience. And I think John wants to remind us of that darkness right off the bat, even in his account of the resurrection. I mean, he wants us to feel the hurt. He doesn't want us to ignore it. He doesn't want us to gloss over it. He doesn't want us to just move right to praise. He wants us to enter into the lament of the darkness first, even in this greatest story of the Bible. Because as we see in this story, that's going to make the whole point of the story hit home that much harder. What Jesus did for us and the fact that he overcame death. It's a message for you and for me that darkness and death are not the last word. They're not the last word. Jesus is the last word. Brothers and sisters, that should give us great joy today. That much greater joy, having understood the darkness that we experience. So let's look at the story. A woman shuffles quickly through the streets of Jerusalem. She shuffles because it's dark and she doesn't want to lose her footing. I'm sure that the ground was probably gravelly and slippery at spots. But she also, while shuffling, she moves quickly because she is desperate. She is desperate to be with her Lord Jesus Christ. Whether he's alive or dead, she feels compelled to be near him. See, Mary Magdalene is that kind of person. She's that kind of disciple. Her faith, even in the darkest and most hopeless of times, is an abiding faith, a sticking faith, a hanging in there beyond hope kind of faith. And here's the kind of faith that Jesus desires from everyone who follows him, everyone who believes. Mary Magdalene wants and wills to be as near to Jesus as she possibly can, even if he lies dead and rotting and stinking in a tomb. It's because of her loyal faith that we find this woman on the move just before dawn. But when she gets to the tomb, she immediately sees that there's something wrong. There's something amiss. See, the stone that had been rolled across the entrance of the tomb had been rolled away, and she knows this is not right. She sees it. She panics. She starts running. And we can just imagine the deep and conflicting emotions that must have lent speed to her heels on that early morning. Confusion, frustration, helplessness, anger, fear. She goes to where Peter and John are staying, and she beats on the doors with her fists. And when the two disciples answer the door, probably rubbing sleep out of their eyes, Mary tells them what she saw, right? Actually, no. Mary doesn't tell them what she saw. She saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance of the tomb. What she tells Peter and John is how she interpreted what she saw. What does she say? She says, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So notice, Mary Magdalene saw, but she did not understand, at least not yet. But I do find it impressive and interesting that even in death, Mary still considers Jesus her Lord, right? I mean, she is that devoted. She is that committed. And at this point in the narrative, Mary completely drops off the scene, and the focus shifts to these two disciples that she has roused from their beds. And I wonder, did the thought of Jesus' resurrection even cross Peter and John's minds? I'm doubtful. Because look, Mary had already kind of implanted her interpretation of what had happened and what she had seen into their heads. And of course, also still fresh in their memory was Jesus' humiliation and his suffering and his horrible death. And of course, there's the most obvious thing. Ordinary people don't usually rise from the dead, right? However, as those disciples had learned, and as we have learned, ordinarily doesn't necessarily apply to Jesus. So I wonder. Either way, once again, the gospel writer describes this running scene. This time, it's the two disciples running as fast as they can. This time, they're running toward the tomb as opposed to Mary running away from it. But again, I would imagine that the emotions that they were feeling, the emotions that lent speed to them as they made their way to the tomb were comparable to Mary's. Confusion and frustration and helplessness and anger and fear. But, now I would probably add to their soup of emotions curiosity. What did really happen? Well, verse 4 tells us that John outran Peter to the tomb. John, being the writer of the gospel, probably took a little bit of pride in that, right? Wants to make sure that everybody knows that he got there first. And he goes a step further than Mary and doesn't just behold the stone being rolled away from the mouth of the tomb, but he actually walks up to the entrance and takes a peek inside. And what does he see? He sees the strips of linen. But he doesn't go in. Probably out of deference for Peter, who was the older of the two and the leader of the group of disciples. And so when Peter arrives, kind of true to form, because Peter is a guy that certainly takes the initiative in most cases, Peter gets there and crawls right into that tomb, and here's what he saw. He saw strips of linen lying there, or if you want to imagine it in a little bit more accurate way, I would say that those strips of linen were probably collapsed where Jesus lay. And the cloth that covered Jesus' head was neatly folded and set aside. Certainly not what you would expect to find at the scene of a grave robbery. I mean, why would you remove the strips of linen? Like, I'd rather carry this dead guy naked than have something wrapped around him, right? Why take the time to neatly fold the headcloth and put it to the side? Yeah, Peter saw more than Mary, but he saw differently as well. And if you want to get into the Greek of it, the word that John uses for see in Mary's case, and the word that John uses for Peter in his case are different. Mary saw with the Greek word blepo, which is kind of the common, everyday, ordinary usage of the word see. She saw with blepo eyes, okay? But John uses a different word when it comes to Peter. Peter saw with a word that in Greek is theoreo, which is where our word theory comes from. And so he saw and actually was thinking about and registering and carefully considering what he saw. Now, John doesn't tell us what Peter concluded. The jury's still out on that. But when John enters the tomb, confronted with the evidence before him, the removed stone, the unoccupied tomb, the strips of linen lying collapsed where Jesus was, and the folded headcloth, John, it says, saw and believed. John saw and understood. And he quickly adds this parenthetical note in verse 9. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. But John saw and he believed. You know, it's only later, I would imagine, after all these things had taken place, that the disciples realized that the Old Testament scriptures had pointed to this all along, but all of this takes a little bit of time. And yet John, when confronted with the evidence, believed. Now, it's interesting to think about this because John was the youngest of the disciples. He was probably still a boy at this point. And yet he is the first recorded believer in the resurrection. And he was a believer in a way that he didn't have to see the risen Christ. John believed just on the basis of what he saw at the tomb, that Jesus had really been raised from the dead, that he really and truly was the Lord of all creation, that death had been truly defeated by their master and their teacher, that everything that Jesus said was true. Yes, this is the single most amazing and astonishing event in all of history. You wouldn't know it based on the way that John records it. It seems so understated. It just says, finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. But yet, this is nothing less than the birth of the Christian faith. Told as plainly and as simply as possible, but this is the birth of the Christian faith. Well, Peter and John return home, and the focus shifts back to Mary. Now, I think it's a little bit odd that the disciples didn't check back with her after they had gone and seen what they saw. Perhaps they tried to find her but couldn't. Anyway, Mary returns to the tomb, and she stood outside crying. And there was something very beautiful written in a commentary that I read about this. Usually, commentaries don't really state things so beautifully, but just listen to this. Mary returned to the tomb and stood outside crying. And in a way, her grief represents the grief of the whole world. The whole world that is still very much overwhelmed by darkness, still very much acquainted with the cruelty of death. But then something compels Mary to bend over herself and look into the tomb. Perhaps it was her own curiosity rising up. Perhaps it was a flicker of hope. She looks in and she sees these two angels dressed in white sitting where Jesus had laid. They looked at her and they said, "Woman, why are you crying?" Which I see as a very pastoral question. Not sarcastic, not like, hey, we know something and you don't, but a very pastoral question. Why are you crying? Mary answers, "They have taken my Lord away, and I do not know where they have put him." Still crying, seeing angels dressed in white, but still not understanding. But then she turns from the mouth of the tomb, and she sees Jesus standing there. And he repeats the angel's question, "Woman, why are you crying?" And then he adds another, "Who is it that you are looking for?" Now understand, Jesus knew better than anyone why Mary was crying. He knew that the tears of Mary were representative of the tears of all humanity. That this was a manifestation of the grief and lament that had enveloped the human race ever since Adam and Eve fell into sin. And Mary was weeping right at that very moment because she believed that death had done to Jesus' body what death does to every person's body, rendering it vulnerable, decaying, decomposing. So Mary Magdalene, early on that Easter morning, is representative of the human condition because without God's intervention, that is the only direction that we're headed. Deeper into the darkness, toward despair, toward death. She is at once every single one of us and the whole lot of us taken together. Why did John start his resurrection narrative pointing once again to the darkness? Because it is precisely into that situation of darkness and dereliction, that Easter must burst forth. Jesus himself knew that he and Mary both needed the tears if the truth of what just happened was going to mean exactly what it still means. That we have the hope of new life right where we need it most, in the midst of a world that is full of decay and death. Well, Mary still doesn't quite understand. She thinks it's the gardener. And she responds to Jesus with kind of an accusation. She says, "Hey, if you have carried him away, tell me where you put him and I will get him." Notice this. She doesn't understand. But she, again, is absolutely, single-mindedly determined to be with Jesus. And in my mind, that brings us to the turning point of this story. The takeaway, whatever you want to call it. One word. Jesus speaking her name. Mary. Mary. It's me. Mary. This one word, her own name, spoken by the most significant person that she has ever known. This one name spoken by the most significant person that any one of us know, changed Mary's life forever. And it should remind us of things like what Jesus said in John chapter 10, that the good shepherd knows his sheep and calls them by name, and his sheep know his voice. Seeing is wonderful. Knowing the story of Jesus and his death and resurrection is wonderful, but it doesn't necessarily lead to belief or a relationship. See, it's not seeing, it's believing that is most important. And it was in that one word, Jesus speaking his dear daughter's name, Mary, that she believed, that she encountered the risen Christ. She responded to Jesus' voice. She cried out, Rabboni. She rushed over to him and held on to him for dear life. Well, Jesus allows Mary to embrace him for a long moment, proving to her that he was not some kind of an untouchable spirit, that he is a real, physical, caring, affectionate person who's happy to greet someone that he loves. But when that moment passes, what does Jesus do? He gives Mary a job to do. And when you think about it, in all the Gospels, when a man or woman encounters Jesus, he gives them a mission. And to Mary, he says, go to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. And please don't miss the significance of this message. This should be fresh in our minds. Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, remember the disciples, every single one of them deserted Jesus. And Jesus giving Mary this charge to go tell them something very specific in calling them brothers. It beautifully points to the power of the forgiveness of sins. Referring to my Father and your Father, my God and your God, points beautifully to the power of reconciliation. No, Jesus is not angry with his disciples. Jesus has forgiven whatever shortcomings had been laid bare in the previous couple of days. Jesus was looking to meet them and to greet them and to be with them again. Jesus communicates here just what he accomplished on the cross and what it means for those whom he calls by name. Salvation and resurrection and eternal life. Well, Mary runs back to where the other disciples are, and she becomes the first apostle in the history of the Christian church. She becomes the first person who says to another person, I have seen the Lord. And the good news for us today is this. If you have faith, then you have also seen the risen Lord. The trumpets might not blare at every moment of your life as a result. In fact, you might very well do your share of crying as well. But often it's in the midst of those bitter tears, those tears that acknowledge darkness and death that still lingers in this world, that Easter happens. The risen Jesus Christ calls your name this morning, speaking words of promise into your life, singing to you of his love, making clear to you that you are his treasured possession, reminding you of why he died and why he rose again. John writes at the end of this chapter, we're going to look at it next week, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. Brothers and sisters, by faith, we have also seen the Lord. And for now, that is enough. It's not everything just yet. There's better coming. But it's enough today while it's still dark. Let's bow our heads in prayer.